Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the next in our Supergen Offshore Renewable Energy Hub series of webinars. My name's Deborah Greaves. I'm Professor of Ocean Engineering here at the University of Plymouth and the Director for the Supergen Offshore Renewable Energy Hub. And it's great to have you with us this afternoon. I want to say how many this is in our series, but I don't have the number at hand. But this is another in our series of webinars. We normally have these at lunchtime, but because we are joined by international speakers this time, then we've shifted the time, and so that's why we're running it at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, which is actually very early in the morning in the US. So we're really delighted to have our two speakers today. We have Dr. Bryson Robertson and Dr. Hilary Boudet from the Oregon State University in the US. And today we're going to have two sections to the talk. First of all, we're going to hear a little bit about the open water testing facility at PacWave in Oregon. And then we're going to hear from Hilary about community perspectives of wave energy and open water testing. So I think we've got a good number in the audience now, so I think we shall get started. And I would like to invite Bryson to start this afternoon. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Deborah. Well, it's exciting to be here. Appreciate everyone coming out. Like I said, I'm Dr. Bryson Robertson, and I'm joined with Dr. Hilary Boudet. I'm the director of the Pacific Marine Energy Center. And Hilary, if you can go to the next slide, I can give you sort of a visual perspective of what our goals are as a center. And ultimately, our goal is to use the immense and consistent power of the ocean to make clean electricity and use that clean electricity to hopefully displace fossil fuels, and in the end, mitigate the worst impacts of climate change. So visually, this sort of gives an overview of what PMAC is and our goals. But if we go to the next slide, you'll see that in terms of a broader perspective in a traditional sense, our vision at PMAC is to connect people to the power of the ocean. It's a collaboration between Oregon State University, the University of Washington, and the University of Alaska Fairbanks. The center's been around for approximately 20 years. Primarily funded by the U.S. Department of Energy and the U.S. Navy. We have about 120 personnel within the center across faculty members, research staff, and students. If you go to the next slide, Hilary. We span the West Coast is one of the things that we're really proud about. So when we're talking about wave and tidal energy in the U.S. context, we use our branding PMAC, which is the collaboration between, like I said, Fairbanks, Washington, and ourselves. On the offshore wind side, we work under a slightly different banner, the PAUS, or the Pacific Offshore Wind Consortium, where we collaborate with folks down in California, the California Polytech at Humboldt and at San Luis Obispo. And then as well, we collaborate with the University of Victoria in Canada. So we try and have a pan-Pacific coast of North America vision to renewable energy from the ocean. So from a broad perspective, our capabilities, we like to try and break it up in terms of R&D, testing, which of course will be a big component today, and an educational mission of the center. And when we look at this, we really try and emphasize a three-legged stool. We need to account for the technological aspects, the environmental aspects, and the societal aspects of all of the work we do. And across all of this is a huge outreach and engagement component to understand where communities of place and communities of practice interact with our mission. One more slide there, Hilary. One more click. To give a sort of really quick overview, knowing that these slides will be distributed, on the technical side, we do a lot of things from wave energy converters to floating offshore wind to tidal turbines to hybrid modeling, survivability, marine robotics. On the environmental side, we have a huge group, or not a huge group, a good solid group of folks looking at sediment transport, benthic ecosystems, site characterization, geotech conditions. But more of the focus today is going to be on that social side, where we do a lot more of that engagement. Existing industries along the coast, existing users of the coast, our regional economies, and the public perceptions of marine energy in the Oregon context. So one of our biggest facilities, or one of the facilities that gets the most attention, is our PacWave testing facility. So these are both open ocean test sites, approximate off the coast of Oregon. It's about 45 minutes from our main campus. We have two test sites. On the left-hand side, we have our North test site, which is a non-grid connected autonomous test site. It's a nautical mile by nautical mile square where we deploy an ocean sentinel buoy with an umbilical cable, which you could connect into your WEC or your device of choice. On the right-hand side, and what we're going to spend most of our time on today, is the PacWave South facility. So this is a pre-permitted, grid-connected, 20 megawatts, open, fully energetic test site for marine energy devices. This is the first grid-connected test facility along the Pacific coast of the US. We've been in development we've been working on this for close to 20 years in terms of getting permits and moving along. You go to the next slide here, Hillary. So in terms of running backwards, it took us sort of 15 years to get permits to build PacWave and secure the funding to do that. Part of that is because when you go to a permitting agency and one of their first questions they ask you is, well, what are you going to deploy? And when you're in a university test facility, you say, well, I don't know because it's an unclear market. We're sort of trying to find, we probably know it's going to be painted yellow, but it could be a hinged draft. It could be a point absorber. It could be a flap. It takes a long time to negotiate that sort of test facility without a specific device in mind. But the heavy work on the PacWave test site began in 21-22, where we started the underground construction in the top right. So as part of that, we did horizontal directional drills from the shore, offshore about a nautical mile, where the drills popped up again. We drilled 4 of those sites. In the end, we put about 10 kilometers of cable just for that section in underground. And then this summer, we got cables brought across from Scandinavia, across the Atlantic, through the Gulf of Mexico, up through the Panama Canal, up to the West Coast, where they were deployed. It took us, we deployed about 80 kilometers of cable in the offshore facility. We spent about 300 vessel days doing that, getting those cables in. That was finished in August of last year. Over the winter, most of our efforts have been building this utility connection and monitoring facility, which is our onshore base connection facility, where we have 4 independent berths, which couple up with the 4 independent cables. So testing developers can deploy their device, connect into the cable, bring all their data and power to shore in an independent, secure way, and then put it into the local utility district. So that sort of provides a really high level. We'll be opening in the summer for our first clients. So this has been a long time coming. Costs range somewhere between 140 and 160 million. So it's a big deal in the US to have this up and running. And the university leading this effort has additionally been a significant effort. One thing that we're often questions about is, well, why is the site so popular? And why is it sort of always held up as this exemplar of how to build a test facility in the US context? And a lot of that comes from, prior to my time at Oregon State University, was that the fishing community identified this site. There was a lot of effort to engage the local population, the local community, the local industry in identifying the site and how it can support their goals and needs as a community. Over the intervening 20 years, we've done a number of different connections, surveys, and sort of outreach events with the community. And I'm going to pass it over to Hillary at this stage to sort of detail what we found as we start to discuss the community around this test facility.
Okay, thanks, Bryson. I'm noticing that possibly my Microsoft Teams is on, so if it starts dinging a lot, I may stop share and turn it off and come back, but it seems to be okay right now. So, oh, here it's coming. Okay, let me just do that first. I didn't realize it was on. Hold on a second. It's not supposed to be on. Okay. Hopefully that'll take care of that. And then, so my role, so I've been lucky enough to be, hold on, there it comes. I've been lucky enough to be hanging out with a bunch of engineers as a social scientist and trying to understand how the public perceives wave energy testing and on the US West Coast. So you see here kind of an overview of where I'm going, but we're going to talk about some survey work that we've done and some interview work that we've done to understand these perspectives. So I'll give you a little bit of background in the literature around how we think about public perceptions of wave energy. And we've done some previous surveys prior to this work to understand that. And then I'll show you some survey work that we've done and some interviews. So from our previous work that we've done on the West Coast, trying to understand how people think about wave energy, we know that we have generally low familiarity with wave energy when you ask about it. It's a relatively new energy technology, even though we have been working for a long time at OSU on the test facility. But when you talk to people about what it is and you tell them a little bit more about what it is, you see generally positive attitudes. And so we'll look at how that worked in this survey as well. And then the other thing I wanted to talk to you about a little bit was some theory that we have from social science about how the public perceives new energy technologies like wave energy. Um, the One of the theories that has been becoming more popular in the literature around public perceptions is this idea of social representations theory. Um, the the idea here is that for these kind of new energy technologies that people aren't quite familiar with, they look at other technologies that they may be more familiar with and anchor their perceptions of those technologies in those other technologies. So other types, if wave energy is seen as renewable energy in the ocean, they may anchor their perceptions around other types of renewable energy sources that they're more familiar with, like solar and wind. Another aspect that quite a few people in the UK have done a lot of work on is the idea of place attachment. And so, this role that if new facilities or new energy projects come into places that people are particularly attached to because of their tour recreational value or other types of economic value, then they will take place protective action. I'm sorry, I don't know how to get that to turn off right now, but we'll make it through. So one of the things that I've been working on in sort of bigger than just looking at wave energy, but all sorts of
Anyway,
perception.
sorry to
Yeah.
interrupt. We can't hear that, so
Okay, good,
it's
because it's
distracting
dinging
you,
on
but
my
we
end.
can't
So
hear
thank
it.
you. I
Yeah,
look
don't
crazy
worry.
because I'm like worried about this dinging, but okay, good. So you can't hear it. That's
We
good.
can't. No.
So, so one of the larger parts that I've been thinking about is just public perceptions of energy development more generally. And so, a piece that I wrote a couple of years ago tried to understand all the different factors that matter for public perceptions and responses to new energy technologies. Um, and so I kind of bucketed them into these four different categories and have used that framework to try to understand these perceptions of wave energy and other sources of energy development. So the first factor has to do with the technology itself. What are perceptions of its risks and benefits, its costs, the scale of it, its what it looks like, how risky it's perceived to be. A second aspect has to do with the people that are most affected by it. So their sociodemographic factors matter in how people perceive energy development, their values, the norms, what they perceive of other people, cues that they're getting from elites, the trust they have in industry or government. And then, of course, the place within which it's proposed. So, is it on the existing, what's on the already existing landscape or seascape? What kind of physical infrastructure is already there? What kind of existing economics are part of that place? And then finally, the process by which decisions are made about a project. Um, so all of those factors come together to shape public perceptions and responses, and you'll see those factors represented in our survey and interviews as we move forward. So our goal here with this work was to really build on a 2020 survey that we did about wave energy, and then also to push that even further, because one of the things we found in that 2020 survey is that we had a large number of people who responded that they didn't know exactly how they felt about wave energy. And so we really wanted to push into understanding other types of perspectives that aren't necessarily a support or opposition, but don't know or neutral. And so you'll see that in our work here. And we also wanted to include some additional predictors like technological optimism and the perceptions of the process. So our research questions had to do with the main perspectives towards wave energy on the West Coast, and then what factors were distinguishing those perspectives from one another. So if I turn now to our surveys that we did, that was our kind of our first step here. We ran online survey using a survey vendor Qualtrics in the 3 West Coast states, California, Oregon, and Washington. And we got about 3,000 respondents. We collected the data that I'm going to show you today in the fall of 2023. We also ran a second wave this last fall. We're still working on some of that analysis, but it's looking very similar to what I'm going to show you today. So the perspectives don't seem to be changing that much, at least over the course of the year between our surveys. Just to give you a sense of the map over here gives you a sense of where our respondents are from. As with most online surveying, you tend to get survey respondents from more populous counties. And then also we did quota sample to get a range of respondents across our different survey demographic groups. So if we turn now to the results, again, we saw, similar to the 2020 survey, a mix of low familiarity. So when we asked people in our survey, how much have you heard or read about wave energy, the majority responded not at all. So almost 60%. When we did give them a definition of wave energy, what it was, and asked them, would you support leasing of ocean space for this type of development? However, we start to see support. If you look at the blue on the right-hand side here, if you look at the blue chart parts of the pie chart, those are people who answered somewhat support or strongly support. It's over half the sample. There's quite a few people who, again, as we saw in 2020, are saying they don't know or need more information or are in that neither category, neither support or oppose. But very few people who are actually saying they oppose. Only about 15% say they strongly oppose or somewhat oppose. We also asked our survey respondents about how they felt about their perceptions of benefits from wave energy. And you can see here the blue bars here represent people who agreed with these statements about benefits. So quite a bit of agreement about reducing carbon dioxide emissions, creating economic opportunities for local businesses and suppliers, increasing local employment, and reducing the risk of electricity blackouts and brownouts. Agreement with decreasing the ability of wave energy to decrease electricity prices or to increase coastal tourism. You can see there's less agreement with those types of benefits among our respondents. If we turn now to concerns and perceptions of concerns about wave energy, we can see the most agreement is around that it might limit commercial fishing areas and increase risks to ocean marine life, whereas some of these others have a little bit less around, and particularly people are not sure about potential negative impacts to tribal lands, fishing rights, or cultural practices. But just generally, compared to perceptions of benefits, there's a lot more, about a quarter of the sample for each of these questions, that just don't know and are answering don't know about their perceptions of the concerns. So given that we had so many respondents that were answering don't know or neither, which are kind of hard to characterize when you're doing survey research, we decided to take a different approach to our analysis. And instead of trying to trying to predict support or opposition using some of those factors I mentioned in the literature. We instead clustered our respondents based on their answers to the questions across a wide variety of questions we had about wave energy, the risks, the benefits, support, opposition. And we were able to find these perspectives where their answers kind of hung together across these different questions. And then we used a multinomial logistic regression to analyze who's part of those clusters. And so what I'm going to show you now is the results and the clustering that we found in our survey responses. So I'm going to we'll come back to this. But so the first and the kind of biggest cluster is this, was about a third of the sample. And this, we're calling this cluster the kind of cautiously supportive cluster. In general, these are kind of the modal responses of respondents that were in this cluster. They reported a little bit of familiarity with wave energy. They support it somewhat in national electricity generation policy and stance and their development in their state. But they both agree with the statements that we had about benefits, with the exception of coastal tourism. But they also agree with statements about concerns related to wave energy development. So these folks, although they express somewhat support for its development, they see both benefits and concerns. The second cluster, the second most popular cluster in our sample, with about a quarter of respondents, was a disengaged cluster. So this is a group of people that are not reporting much familiarity with wave energy. They are not, and they're basically don't know about a lot of the questions we asked. They don't know if they support its development off the coast of their state. They don't know about benefits. They're not sure about how they feel about the benefits, and they're not sure about how they feel about concerns. So this group of people is just not engaged really in the conversation about wave energy. The kind of the third most prevalent cluster in our sample was what we'd call the advocate cluster. And so this group of people is about 20% of our sample, and they are somewhat more familiar than the other two clusters I showed you with wave energy, and they're very supportive of its development, both as part of a national strategy for electricity generation, but also in terms of development off their state's coast. They strongly agree with the potential benefits that we gave them to look at, and they somewhat disagree with those concerns. And so this group is really the group of people that's advocating strongly for wave energy development. Our fourth cluster is a neutral cluster. So this is distinct cluster from the actual, we tried having just 4 clusters to see if the neutral and the don't knows went together, and they actually didn't, and they look different in the population. So this is a group of people that tends to answer neither to the questions. So they don't answer don't know, but they put themselves kind of in the middle between support and oppose, or agree or disagree, across all these different factors, the benefits, the concerns, and also whether or not they think that development should move forward. And then the final cluster, and the smallest cluster that we found, is a concern cluster that represents a little under 10% of the sample. This group of people is, again, kind of like the advocates, reporting more familiarity than the other clusters, although not a lot, with wave energy, but they're strongly opposed to the development of wave energy off their coast, and they don't seem to want to have that be part of the energy mix more generally in the US context. And they are somewhat agreeing, though they somewhat agree with some of the benefits, they strongly disagree with the tourism benefit and the the ability of wave energy to decrease electricity prices. And they strongly agree with all of those concerns we asked about. They're concerned about risks to marine life, limits to commercial fishing, all of those concerns that we asked about. So now if I turn toward trying to understand who's part of these clusters. How do they break down in terms of the people that are reporting these types of views? If we start with our biggest cluster, that kind of cautiously supportive cluster, that's about a third of the sample, we see that this group tends to be male and higher income than the other groups. They're more likely to be in a somewhat liberal political stance than very liberal. They believe human-caused climate change is happening, and they're also supportive of other types of renewable energy that we asked about. They somewhat trust energy developers, and they believe that the decision-making process has been somewhat fair around decisions related to renewable energy in the ocean. The disengaged cluster, that second most prevalent cluster, tends to be more female and lower income. They are not as optimistic. We asked some questions about their optimism towards technology in terms of solving problems. This group tends to be less optimistic about technology to solve problems. They're somewhat supportive of other types of renewable energy. Drawing on that place attachment literature, we also asked some questions about coastal attachment to our sample, and these folks tend to be less attached to the coast in terms of their responses. They're less trusting of energy developers, and they're mostly unfamiliar with how the siting process has gone. The advocate cluster, that third most prevalent cluster in our sample, tends to be very male, very optimistic about technology to solve problems, supportive of other types of renewable energy development, very trusting of energy developers, believes the process has been fair, and interestingly, is more likely to report a economic identity, which is the community, what they think about their community's identity in terms of economics in the fishing industry. The neutral cluster, the fifth most prevalent cluster that answered mostly neutral to our questions, tends to be a political. So this is how it's different from disengaged. They tend to be more politically moderate. They're less optimistic and more pessimistic about technology to solve problems. They're not very supportive of other types of renewable energy. They're not necessarily attached to the coast. They have some trust in energy developers and somewhat believe that they believe the process for decision making has been a little fair. And then, of course, the smallest sample, the part of the sample, the concerned, looks quite different than the other groups. They're more likely to be very conservative in terms of their political views. They tend to be more pessimistic about technology to solve problems. They're very much attached to the coast in terms of its value to them personally. They're opposed to other types of renewable energy development. They don't believe the process for decision making has been fair. And interestingly, like the advocates, they often tend to have a community economic identity that's related to fishing. So some differences among our clusters here in terms of who's members of these different clusters. So if we think about some key findings from this work, one of the things that we hear a lot when we talk about public perceptions of energy development is that the response is a NIMBY response, not in my backyard or not in my ocean backyard in this case. But we're seeing in distinguishing between those clusters that there are other factors, and it's not just about this a NIMBY response, but these place attachment factors, the perceptions of the process were very strongly associated with those that are concerned. We actually tried looking at some of our geographies to see if the NIMBY part was driving them. With this type of sample, we didn't have so many people that are that proximate, but even when we did try to measure distance, it didn't turn out to be that big of a driver of these clustering. The other thing that comes pretty strikingly is that that advocate cluster, when we differentiate it from the cautiously supportive cluster, there's a strong driver of techno-optimism, so that those advocates tend to be very optimistic about technology to solve problems, and that's not a driver in the cautious cluster. And so I think that suggests that we need to be careful about being overconfident in technology and in communication with the public, uh, being overconfident with the technology, because at least in our sample, the most prevalent cluster is that cautious cluster, cautiously supportive cluster, and their views are not really necessarily being driven by confidence in technology to solve problems. I think it's interesting that we have two distinct clusters between those who are responding neutral and don't know to our questions, and they are different types of people, at least according to our analysis. And so it's really worthwhile, I think, particularly in thinking about communicating about these topics, to consider these kind of non-substantive responses. And then the last point from coming from these surveys is, a lot of research in this area tries to understand how to make people more supportive or move that needle on support. And I think if we can step back a bit and think about perspectives like these clusterings instead of just pure support, this may help us understand and explain some of that local opposition that we see to particular projects. Because if we think about that cautious cluster, that cautiously supportive cluster, because they're seeing both benefits and risks to development, if those risks become more prevalent in a local conversation about a particular project, you could see that group possibly changing their perspective. So I'm going to turn a bit away from the surveys and talk to you a little bit about some interviewing we did on this topic. These interviews were mostly done with folks in Oregon, in somewhat proximity to the PacWave project. So the folks we were talking to were familiar with PacWave. They also were, also at the same time we were doing these interviews, it's important to know that Oregon was considering offshore wind development as well. So that comes up in these responses. And that shaped, I think, a lot of the perceptions as we were talking to these folks. Since then, offshore wind development has been postponed in Oregon. So in terms of the interviews that we did, we talked to about 20 people across a wide variety of different stakeholder groups, the energy developers themselves, folks that were part of the fishing industry, people in kind of like an advocacy group or labor union, and a policymaker. And then we also specifically tried to get some interviews done with Latino coastal community leaders, because that's a growing population on the Oregon coast, but doesn't often show up in our survey efforts. And so these interviews were conducted in both 2023 and 2024. So we have a range of time that we were out talking to folks. Just in general, we asked some questions about how these participants would characterize marine energy. So we talked to them both about wave energy and offshore wind in the siting process in Oregon. And they had pretty distinct perspectives depending on where they were coming from. Developers in the US context in Oregon felt behind Europe and the UK in terms of moving forward with development. And they were in a rush to fulfill some of the Biden administration's goals around renewable energy development. The fishing industry folks, when they talk to us, would emphasize that they're not necessarily against renewable energy development in the ocean, but they do see particular projects, especially offshore wind, as a threat to their economic livelihoods in particular. Those advocacy groups and policymakers and labor unions that we talked to mostly talked about process and argued for seeing a bigger picture and moving more slowly and deliberately in particularly offshore wind development. And then that group of Latino coastal community leaders we talked to didn't have much familiarity or understanding of the technology, either offshore wind or wave energy, but they were interested in learning more. We also heard a big distinction among our interview participants between the siting process around the wave energy PacWave project and offshore wind that was ongoing at the time of our interviews. So the wave energy siting process was seen as collaborative, inclusive, and informative. It was led by OSU, and they saw it as a bottom-up approach that allowed community members to participate and share their concerns. And this created and facilitated an open attitude on the part of the fishing community to really help OSU find the best place for that test facility. In contrast, when people would talk about the offshore wind, and remember, offshore wind was a much bigger uh, project than the test facility, they would talk about it as a top-down box checking exercise with not a lot of local community engagement, not a lot of ability to give impact and input and feedback. And this combined to create a kind of generally negative perception of the federal agency that was charged with siting offshore wind, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. We did also ask our participants about how they felt about risks and benefits from marine renewable energy. On the economic side, they talked about both positive and negative aspects of this type of development. In particular, on the positive side, the use of renewable energy infrastructure, local economic development, but they were concerned about impacts to current ocean users and fisheries production, and the displacement of local workforce. So you can see some of the same risks and benefits coming up that we asked about on the survey. On the environmental side, interestingly, they talked mostly about the negative impacts, potential negative impacts, more than the positive. And those negative impacts focused on impacts to the marine and coastal ecosystem and marine species, and were then linked to social impacts related to coastal economies. And then just to say a little bit more about how Latino coastal community leaders talked about marine energy in the Oregon context, they didn't tend to recognize many of the specific marine energy projects that are happening on the Oregon, that at the time were happening on the Oregon coast. They were most concerned about the potential of losing jobs. Many of the folks in this community work in fish processing. And so they had some interesting things to say about being the first to be impacted if things change, but the last to find out about potential changes. And this the widespread impact if there were to be job loss from this type of development. We did hear quite a bit from folks about how to make the siting process better around marine renewable energy, including trying to make it a more long-term vision and promote coordination across all the different actors that are in those coastal areas, federal actors, regional actors, state actors, environmental scientists, fishing industry, to have some more key values and principles in those interactions. The labor unions were particularly interested in apprenticeships and training and retention of local workforce. And then they did really like the aspect of PacWave as a small scale demonstration project that was grounded in the community, and were anxious to see something like that around offshore wind. So just to go back to some of those key findings and reiterate between the surveys and the interviews. So for the interview side, again, those process perceptions seem to be quite important in terms of the interview participants as well as those survey respondents. So again, not just about this not in my backyard aspect to things. Also, a lot of the comments in the interviews were less about the technology itself and more about values and process. So again, to be that caution about being overconfident in technology to solve problems. There's also quite a few, even in our interviews when we were targeting people that we thought would know a lot about what's happening, we still found groups that don't know a lot about these projects, but they're interested in learning more. And some of these concerns about impact to marine environment and ocean users can help explain some of that local opposition that we see to particular projects, even though we're seeing kind of widespread support for wave energy in the aggregate survey data. I just want to say a couple of things before people ask questions. I worked very extensively with a postdoc at PMEC on this work, Greg Stelmack, and a PhD student in the School of Public Policy, Johanna Cervantes. And then Allison Walkingshaw helped us with the graphics, and of course the Pacific Marine Energy Center for continuing to support social science research about this. And then the funding for this was provided by the U.S. Department of Energy. And with that, I will open it up to questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Hilary and Bryson. That was really fascinating, really interesting talks. Thank you so much. And well, I can't find the clap hands button on the thing, but I think we should give you a round of applause from if anyone can find the right button. Well done. Thank you. Thank you very much. And so, yes, please do. Thank you, Rosie. You found the right button. Please do either put your questions into the chat, or you can use the raise hand function if you've got the question. So I think that's working. So please do that if you have a question. Otherwise, you can also put the questions into the chat. We've already got one in there, I think, for Bryson. So should we start with that one? And that's a question from Alex Pitchard. Are you still on the call, Alex?
Yes, I am. Thanks, Deborah.
Great, thank you. Would you like, so you can unmute and ask your question.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I was just wondering if you already had project lined up for deployment at PacWave, and if if you're allowed to tell us a bit more about those.
Sure. So, of course, the situation in the US right now is evolving rapidly. But as of right now, we have five technology developers who've been funded to deploy PacWave. The biggest of those would be CalWave Technologies out of California, which has a submerged point absorber type scenario, not unlike Alex. I think you're at Carnegie, so it's not dramatic.
Yeah, Carnegie.
So that's CalWave out of California. Sea Power is an Oregon-based developer. They've also been funded to deploy at PacWave. So they are a point absorber, but with a rotary PTO type setup. Acela Power out of Seattle is also funded to go to the site. They are a point absorber WEC with a reaction ring, so sort of a heave plate point absorber style. And then Aqua Harmonics, which is a smaller group, is partnering up with Portland State University and some novel PTO developments coming out of Portland State University, and they are funded as well. There is another company, and I feel terrible, it's not coming to mind right now, but there's one more company that's funded to come to the site. So that's on the technology developers. There's a whole host of other ancillary development that's happening. So the site's open to all sorts of things. One thing you cannot put at the site is you can't put an offshore wind turbine. You can't put a turbine spinning at the site. But if you want to test anchors, you want to test mooring lines, you want to test new acoustic sensors, those sorts of things, those are all fair game. So we have a project looking at a whole array of new acoustic sensor development, some geotech condition and new methods for that, and some seafloor instrumentation and ROV docking technology that's being tested at the site. So there's a whole array of different technologies, and we're hoping that as we sort of emerge from some of this uncertainty, we'll see some of the bigger funding opportunities come back online to fill that pipeline even more.
Great, thanks. That's exciting to see already so many projects line up. So yeah, thanks for the nice presentation as well, and thanks Hilary too for the nice perspective on community aspects.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. And we've got a question from Cheryl Strong. I'm not sure who wants to take this one. Cheryl, are you on the call? Do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I'm just curious about where funding stands at this point, and you might not know the answer to that question. I totally understand that.
Well, and Bryson can chime in too. clearly we're at this moment of uncertainty about where this kind of work is going to go. That being said, I think understanding for any type of energy development, and I've done a lot of different types of energy development, not just renewables, but fracking and liquefied natural gas. Uh, the views of the public matter in terms of development, particularly when we move into the public decision-making processes. And you have, in the US, in our system, there's a lot of different points where decisions are made, and local, state, federal. And so I think this type of work will continue to be relevant. We'll see, where the funding for it comes. I think one of the things that's been interesting working on this and having this kind of, usually we don't have this many respondents in a region for for analysis like this, and being able to cluster, I think, is an interesting thing to move forward with, even on different types of energy development, because it moves us out of just thinking about people as opponents and supporters, and thinking more broadly about how people form opinions, and how those opinions may be more nuanced than that opposition and support, and what that means in terms of communicating with folks. Because if you have a sense of who your disengaged group is, you may be able to find them and engage them in a different way with your communication than if you kind of have a sense of who the advocate group is. And the other thing I was thinking about moving forward with this is trying to understand, like, folks like who are on this call who are quite engaged, right, where they stand, and compare that to some of the public views, because that might also help explain some of what we see when projects get proposed. Yeah. And Bryson, I don't know if you want to say more about some of the PacWave funding, or more the technical funding.
Yeah, no, I guess I think I'll sort of build on what you just said, and then I'll sort of get back to the question there, Cheryl. I think Hillary really articulated that very clearly. And, in my role, I spent a lot of time going to DC to sort of advocate for funding and identify and sort of preach to folks over there around what the opportunities are. And the research that Hillary and team do is so incredibly important, because to some extent, yes, the narrative does change as administration changes and their goals change, but there's a strong thread here of trying to identify what do folks in different political spheres believe, and how do we communicate them? What are the attributes they're most interested in? So, while I'm not a giant fan of dominating everyone else, but there is an opportunity if the US can capture this market and develop a number of technologies to really dominate an emerging space. So that's something that resonates really well with the administration currently. So we do work on different nuances or different aspects of the technology or the sort of energy generation opportunity as we move forward. So that helps as we look forward. Currently, yes, it's very fluid. It's very uncertain. On the offshore wind side, it's very uncertain what the future looks like, but I do believe there's still be opportunities in there. On the wave side, so far it's uncertain, but we're still moving ahead. We're actually going through our final decision-making period today and tomorrow with our federal agency partners on approving the last stage of the PacWave sites, which is 5 years of operational funding for the university to run the site for 5 years. So that's going on yesterday and today. So I think in a lot of cases, there's a lot of uncertainty, but impacts on the ground thus far have been fairly small, with the unfortunate scenario that Hillary does some really good work on offshore wind, and the community benefits, and the administration hasn't loved that project thus far. So, but we're gonna make it happen. It's gonna happen. So,
yeah.
Good. Enjoy the optimism. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. I think the other thing to remember too is, like, the system in the US allows states to move forward with things too, and in ways, even if the federal government is not moving as forward as fast. And so, a place like California is moving forward with some of their offshore wind efforts. So the work continues to be relevant. Or even Oregon, even though the official leasing process has been postponed around offshore wind, there's still a state level, state legislative mandated effort to continue to roadmap what offshore wind might look like in the Oregon context.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much for the question. We did have to discuss that, but it's difficult. And thank you very much to Paul Gay for your comment you put into the chat there to support that. If you want to say some more about that, then please do. But I'm going to go to Gillian Ella first of all. If you're on the call, would you like to ask your question, Gillian?
Hey, yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So this was a fantastic presentation, and I caught on to the piece that you were mentioning, Hillary, about the how the fishing community was involved in deciding and sort of maybe negotiating or giving their input on the location of the testing site. And I'd like to hear a little bit more about that. And my follow-up question is, was that engagement, that participation in decision-making sort of intentionally sought out by the researchers, or was that sort of born out of engagement and sort of trust building and communication? So yeah, sort of which came first?
Well, I don't know if I can talk about which came first, but both were definitely intentional. I think around the PacWave process, it predated my time a bit, but I've heard quite a bit about it from the interviewing, but also from folks at OSU who were involved in that effort prior to me being here. One of whom recently retired, Flaxen Conway, but who also worked quite extensively with the Pacific Marine Energy Center. And one of the things that is very, very helpful in the U.S. context around this type of engagement in a university setting is that we have extension. We're the land grant university for the state of Oregon. And so we have both extension like in every county, but also Sea Grant, Oregon Sea Grant, which does specifically extension around extension work, which is kind of like engagement work around things that are happening in the marine environment and coastal communities. And so there are people from the university in all of these counties that are along the coast, and they have existing relationships with community members. So even prior to something like PacWave coming through, there is a university presence in all these locations, which I think PacWave took advantage of. Also, there was quite a bit of human dimensions research that went on. Some of it funded by the Department of Energy, some of it funded by, I think, the Pacific Ocean Energy Trust, which is a more regional organization. They did things like what I presented here, but in the early 2000s around, surveying and interview work, also focus groups, engagement efforts to really reach out to particularly the fishing community at that time to understand what their concerns might be, where might be a spot in the ocean that wouldn't interrupt their existing livelihoods. And so there's kind of I wasn't there, but there's a story that the fishing community tells about a meeting that took place where there were maps out and, the OSU folks were showing them where wave energy might go, a pilot facility might go, and they were kind of, with Sharpies, and markers showing them where not to put it, where to put it. And there was actually a group of fishermen that came together that they called themselves the FINE group, Fishers and Natural Energy, that helped coordinate some of the communication. It was kind of a combination of Sea Grant and the fishing community that put that together and helped get some of the input from the fishing community. I think another thing to remember too is that that's a much smaller project than offshore wind, because the offshore wind development that was proposed for Oregon was around commercial scale offshore wind development. So it had a much bigger footprint than a test facility. would have. So I think that's another thing to keep in mind when we do a comparison across the two. But it definitely, it was a long process. There were starts and stops, some of which were related to public input, some of which had nothing to do with public input and everything to do with the economics and the markets of energy at the time. And so that gave some time for the process to play out in ways that allowed for input and feedback. Whereas I think some of the offshore wind siting was happening on a shorter time clock that may not have left as much space for that. And I don't know, Bryson, it predated you too, right? So I don't know if you have, but you probably heard things as well.
It did. The only thing I'll add there is, there was some great foresight from Dr. Belinda Batten prior to my time into actually writing in funding to support the fishing community to attend these meetings, to take time out of their days to support it, so that they could aggregate and develop that fine group, so that there was a sort of an avenue for the fishing community to find people within their community to advocate for their needs and move on that slower time clock, like you said.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Do you think there's a lesson there for the offshore wind sector then?
I mean, I do think there's an opportunity here in the pause that's happened, the postponement and I think that's some of what the roadmap process is intended to do, that the state is running right now to try to develop some more of that trust, and that, have some time to do that important work. You saw on the 4 factors that matter for public perceptions, like process is a really important one, and views on the process, its fairness, its are really important. And some of the other work I've done, we've coded comments on, in this case, it was liquefied natural gas proposals along the coast of Oregon. And when we code comments for content, the public comments coming in, a quarter of them were about the process. So the process really matters, and how people perceive that process really matters for views on this type of development.
Well, thank you very much. We're coming towards time now. So I just wanted to, on behalf of everyone on the call, say another huge thank you to Hilary and to Bryson. I think that was really fascinating, and I think we can all pick up some lessons from that, and we all wish you the very best of luck for what happens next, and to make sure that we keep the funding into this area. So thank you for all the excellent work you're doing. Thank you. Thank you also to the audience for attending today, and for all your excellent questions and contributions into the chat as well. I should also mention that the next webinar in our series is coming up very soon. So one's going to be on Monday, the 12th of May, back to the usual time of 1 o'clock lunchtime. And that one the title is Design for Cyclic Loading of Wind Turbine Monopiles. And that's hosted by Professor Byron Byrne at the University of Oxford and Avi Schonberg from Ørsted. So please do join us for that webinar. And thank you again to Hilary and Bryson. It's great to see you. And thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks. Yeah.